The dog tags were rusted beyond recognition, their silver surface eaten away by 50 winters of Detroit cold, but Bobby Sullivan still carried them in his coat pocket every single day. The metal was so corroded that most people would have thrown them away decades ago, but Bobby could still feel the raised edges where a name used to be etched in block letters. Michael Williams, age 22, blood type O positive. The kid who should have made it home to see his baby daughter take her first steps, speak her first words, graduate from high school. Instead, Bobby made it home carrying those tags like a millstone around his soul, and Michael Williams went back to Michigan in a flag-draped coffin, leaving behind a 6-month-old daughter who would grow up knowing her father only through faded photographs and her mother's tearful stories. On this particular January morning in 2024, with the temperature sitting at a brutal 8 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind howling through downtown Detroit like the screams of the damned, Bobby pressed those tags between his fingers as he shuffled through the snow toward the Eastland Mall. Each step was agony. His right leg, or what was left of it below the knee, screamed with every movement. The prosthetic he'd gotten from the VA 20 years ago was held together with duct tape, electrical tape, and prayers to a God he wasn't sure was listening anymore. The cold made the phantom pain in his missing limb feel like someone was driving red-hot nails through bone that wasn't even there, nerves that had been severed by shrapnel in a jungle on the other side of the world, firing signals of agony that would never stop. The stump where his leg ended was raw and bleeding again. The prosthetic didn't fit properly anymore. He'd lost so much weight living on the streets that it rubbed against skin and bone with every step. But he couldn't afford to get it adjusted, couldn't navigate the bureaucratic maze of the VA system that had already failed him so many times. So he wrapped the stump in old t-shirts and kept walking, because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant dying. He wasn't planning to cause trouble. Bobby Sullivan never planned to cause trouble. All he wanted was to survive another night in a city that had forgotten men like him, in a country that thanked veterans for their service with empty words while letting them die on the streets. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had fought to defend freedom and democracy, and now he wasn't free to sleep anywhere, and the democratic system had voted him into invisibility. The parking garage at Eastland Mall wasn't much to look at: concrete and steel, oil stains, and the lingering smell of exhaust fumes. But it was covered, and the concrete retained just enough heat from the cars during the day to keep a man from freezing to death. Bobby had been sleeping there for 3 weeks, always careful to move before the morning shift arrived, always trying to stay invisible. He had learned the rhythms of the place, when the security guards made their rounds, when the cleaning crews came through, when the early shoppers started arriving. He had become a ghost, haunting the margins of normal life. But last night, the storm had been too fierce, the wind too cutting, the snow too deep. The Weather Service had issued warnings about frostbite and hypothermia, advising people to stay indoors. Bobby had no indoors to stay in, so he had burrowed deeper into his makeshift shelter between 2 cars, wrapped in a sleeping bag that was more holes than fabric, and tried to wait out the storm. He had stayed too long, slept too deeply, and when morning came, he was still there. That's when Frank Torres found him. Frank had been working mall security for 8 years, ever since a bullet to the spine during a routine traffic stop ended his career with Detroit PD. The bullet had come from a scared kid with a stolen gun, and it had left Frank with chronic pain, a permanent limp, and a pension that barely covered his medications. He understood what it meant to have your life derailed by circumstances beyond your control, to go from being someone who mattered to someone society would rather forget. He knew a veteran when he saw one. There was something in the way they carried themselves, even when they were broken down. Something in the posture, the way they scanned their surroundings, the way they positioned themselves with their backs to walls. Bobby had all the signs: the 1,000-yard stare, the hypervigilance, the way he startled at sudden noises. Frank had seen it in his own mirror often enough to recognize it in others. "Come on, Bobby," Frank had said quietly that morning, his hand resting on his radio, but not yet calling it in. They had developed an understanding over the past few weeks, a mutual respect between 2 men who had served and been discarded. "You know I can't let you stay here. The boss is already breathing down my neck about this." Bobby had looked up from where he sat between a rusted Honda Civic and a dented pickup truck. his back against a concrete pillar that was stained with decades of automotive fluids. His eyes were bloodshot from the cold and lack of sleep, his face gaunt from malnutrition, his beard matted with ice crystals. But there was still dignity there, still the bearing of a man who had once stood at attention and meant it. "I know, Frank," Bobby had whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that whipped through the garage like a living thing. "Just give me 5 minutes to get my stuff together. Don't want to leave a mess." Even homeless, even broken, Bobby Sullivan was still a Marine. He policed his area, left no trace, took responsibility for his actions. The Corps had beaten those habits into him so deeply that 50 years of civilian life hadn't been able to erase them. But Frank's supervisor, Susan Hartwell, had been watching the security cameras from her office on the second floor of the mall. Corporate headquarters had been breathing down her neck about the homeless problem for months, sending increasingly stern emails about liability issues and customer complaints. She'd already received 2 written warnings about her soft approach to trespassers, and her job was hanging by a thread. Susan was a single mother with 2 kids, Emma, 12, and Tyler, 8, and she couldn't afford to lose this job. Her ex-husband was 3 months behind on child support, her car was making ominous noises that she couldn't afford to have fixed, and her health insurance was tied to her employment. She had sympathy for the homeless veterans who sought shelter in the mall, but sympathy didn't pay the rent or put food on the table for her children. The call went out to Detroit PD at 6:47 a.m., logged as trespassing in progress, repeat offender. Officer Maria Santos arrived 12 minutes later, her patrol car sliding slightly on the ice as she pulled into the garage. She'd been a cop for 15 years, working the streets of Detroit through the city's bankruptcy, the economic collapse, the slow, painful recovery. She had arrested more homeless veterans than she cared to count, and it never got easier. Each arrest felt like a failure of the system she had sworn to serve and protect. Maria had grown up in southwest Detroit, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who had worked double shifts in the auto plants to give their children a better life. She had become a cop because she wanted to help people, to make a difference in her community. But somewhere along the way, the job had become more about managing society's failures than preventing them. Bobby didn't run when he saw the patrol car. He never ran. Where would he go? His bad leg wouldn't carry him far, and running would only make things worse. He had learned long ago that cooperation was the path of least resistance, that fighting the system only brought more pain. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, his hands visible at all times. The habits of military training never really left, even when everything else did, even when the country you had served decided you were disposable. "Sir, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back," Officer Santos said, her voice professional but not unkind. She had read Bobby's file during the drive over, 4 previous arrests for trespassing, all at different locations, all during cold weather. No violence, no theft, no drugs. Just a man trying to find somewhere warm to sleep. Bobby complied without a word, his movements slow and careful. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that echoed through the empty garage like a gunshot, metal against metal, freedom against captivity. As they walked toward the patrol car, Frank Torres watched from the security office, his hand clenched into a fist, knowing he'd just sent a fellow veteran into a system that had already failed him once. "I'm sorry, Bobby," Frank whispered to the empty office, but the words were lost in the wind. The Wayne County Courthouse was a monument to bureaucratic indifference, its gray concrete walls and harsh fluorescent lighting designed to drain hope from anyone who entered. Built in the 1960s during the height of urban renewal, it was a brutalist structure that looked more like a prison than a temple of justice. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and despair, echoing with the footsteps of lawyers, defendants, and families caught in the grinding machinery of the legal system. Bobby had been here before for other small crimes of survival: trespassing, loitering, public intoxication when the pain got too bad and the bottle was the only medicine he could afford. Each time, he had been processed through the system like a piece of defective machinery, catalogued, judged, and discarded back onto the streets, with a fine he couldn't pay and a record that made it even harder to find work or housing. He sat in the holding cell for 6 hours before his name was called, sharing the cramped space with 3 other men who, like him, had committed the crime of having nowhere else to go. There was Jerome, a schizophrenic veteran from the Gulf War who talked to voices only he could hear. There was Carlos, a day laborer who had been arrested for sleeping in his car because he couldn't afford both rent and child support. And there was Tommy, a kid barely out of his teens who had aged out of foster care and was learning that the world had no place for him. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? They were all casualties of the same war, the war between survival and society, between human need and legal order. They sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts, waiting for a system that saw them as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. When the bailiff finally called Robert James Sullivan, Bobby stood on unsteady legs and followed the man in uniform down a hallway that seemed to stretch forever. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look sick and desperate. The courtroom was nearly empty, as it always was for the morning docket of minor offences. A few lawyers shuffled papers at their tables, their expensive suits a stark contrast to the shabby defendants they represented. A court reporter sat ready at her machine, her fingers poised to record the mundane tragedies that would unfold. Scattered throughout the gallery were the usual collection of people waiting for their own cases to be called. Family members, social workers, bail bondsmen, and the occasional journalist looking for a story. Bobby had been through this routine enough times to know how it would go. The prosecutor would read the charges in a bored monotone, recommend the standard sentence, and the judge would rubber stamp the decision. He would be sentenced to 30 days in county jail, which was actually better than sleeping on the streets in January, and then he would be released back into the same cycle of poverty and desperation that had brought him here in the first place. Judge Patricia Williams sat behind the bench, reviewing the morning's docket with the same methodical attention she brought to every case. At 52, she had the reputation of being tough but fair, especially when it came to cases involving veterans. Her dark hair was streaked with premature grey, and her brown eyes held the weight of 15 years of seeing humanity at its worst, and occasionally at its best. What most people didn't know was that she donated anonymously to 3 different veteran support organizations, that she had personally funded the legal defense of dozens of homeless vets over the years, and that she kept a photograph of her father in his marine dress blues hidden in her desk drawer. The photograph showed a young man with her same dark eyes and determined chin, wearing the uniform he would die in 2 years after it was taken. She looked up as Bobby entered, taking in his appearance with the trained eye of someone who had seen it all. Thin to the point of gaunt, his cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, wearing a coat that looked like it had survived more winters than wars. The coat was a patchwork of repairs, duct tape holding the sleeves together, safety pins where buttons used to be, stains that told the story of years on the streets. His shoes were held together with tape and hope, and she could see that one of them had a hole worn completely through the sole. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Despite everything, the obvious malnutrition, the signs of chronic pain, the defeat that hung around him like a shroud, there was still something in his eyes that spoke of strength, of a man who had once been someone important, someone who mattered. When she read the name on the docket, something inside her chest tightened like a fist around her heart. Robert James Sullivan, Marine Corps veteran, born 1955, charged with criminal trespass. The name hit her like a physical blow, though she kept her expression carefully neutral through years of judicial training. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, telling stories she'd heard 100 times growing up, stories that had shaped her understanding of heroism and sacrifice. Your father wrote about a Marine named Bobby Sullivan in his letters from Vietnam, said he was the bravest man he ever knew, said Bobby saved his life and the lives of 7 other boys. Your father said that if he made it home, it would be because of Bobby Sullivan. Judge Williams' hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she reached for her water glass, the ice cubes clinking against the sides like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. She had spent her entire adult life wondering about the men who had served with her father, the men who had made it home when he didn't. She had imagined them living full lives, raising families, growing old with honor and dignity. She had never imagined that one of them might end up in her courtroom, charged with the crime of trying to survive. The prosecutor, James Bradley, stood to read the charges with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. At 45, Bradley was ambitious and politically connected, with his eye on the district attorney's office and eventually a judgeship of his own. He saw cases like this as stepping stones, opportunities to demonstrate his tough-on-crime credentials to the voters who would decide his future. "Your Honor," Bradley said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "The defendant is charged with criminal trespass in the first degree. This is Mr. Sullivan's fourth offense for similar charges in the past 2 years. The people recommend 30 days in county jail and a restraining order barring the defendant from the Eastland Mall property. We need to send a message that our business community will not be held hostage by repeat offenders who refuse to utilize available social services." Bobby stood silently during the recitation of his alleged crimes, his head down, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that was part military bearing, part defeat. He had learned long ago not to expect mercy from a system that saw him as a problem to be managed, rather than a human being to be helped. The prosecutor's words washed over him like rain on stone, familiar, expected, meaningless. He thought about the available social services that Bradley had mentioned, the shelters that were always full, that kicked you out at 6 a.m. regardless of the weather, that were more dangerous than the streets because of the violence and theft. The waiting lists for housing assistance that were years long. The VA hospitals that were understaffed and overwhelmed, where you could wait 6 months for an appointment and then be told that your problems weren't service-connected. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Williams said, her voice carefully controlled, fighting to keep the emotion out of it, "do you have legal representation?" Bobby looked up for the first time since entering the courtroom, and their eyes met across the space that separated the bench from the defendant's table. For just a moment, Judge Williams saw something in his face that reminded her of the photographs she had of her father, young, determined, unbroken by the world. There was a ghost of the man he had once been, the Marine who had saved lives and served with honor. "No, ma'am," Bobby said quietly, his voice hoarse from years of shouting to be heard over the wind and traffic of street life. "Public Defender's Office said they're backed up, told me to just plead guilty and get it over with, said it would go easier if I didn't fight it." The words hung in the air like an indictment of the entire system. Judge Williams felt something crack inside her chest, a wall she had built around her heart, to protect herself from cases like this, from the daily parade of human misery that passed through her courtroom. The Public Defender's Office was indeed overwhelmed, handling caseloads that made adequate representation impossible. Justice had become an assembly line, processing defendants as quickly as possible, without regard for their individual circumstances or needs. She looked down at the docket again, at the name that had haunted her family's history, and made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to postpone this hearing for 1 week to ensure you have adequate representation." She turned to her bailiff, a veteran himself who had served in Iraq and understood the weight of what she was doing. "Please contact the office of David Chen and ask him to take this case pro bono. Tell him it's a personal request from the bench." Prosecutor Bradley looked up sharply, his carefully prepared routine disrupted by this unexpected development. "Your Honor, that's highly irregular. This is a simple trespass case. The defendant has already indicated his willingness to plead guilty. There's no need to delay the proceedings or waste the court's time with unnecessary representation." "Mr. Bradley," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years on the bench and a lifetime of wondering about her father's war, "I'll determine what's regular in my courtroom. Mr. Sullivan, you're released on your own recognizance. Please report to Mr. Chen's office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Bobby stood there for a moment, confused by this unexpected turn of events. In his experience, the system didn't offer second chances or personal requests from judges. It processed you, sentenced you, and moved on to the next case like a machine that never stopped grinding. Mercy was not part of the equation. "Ma'am," he said uncertainly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're free to go, Mr. Sullivan, for now." As Bobby turned to leave, moving slowly on his damaged leg, Judge Williams called out one more time. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from the little girl who had grown up without a father, who had been raised on stories of heroism and sacrifice. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you for your service." The words stopped him cold. He turned back, and for the first time in years, Something that might have been hope flickered in his eyes like a candle flame in the wind. "Ma'am?" But Judge Williams had already moved on to the next case, leaving Bobby to wonder what had just happened and why a judge he'd never met before seemed to know something about him that he'd forgotten himself. David Chen was in his office at 7 a.m. the next morning when his phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet of the early morning. The caller ID showed Wayne County Courthouse, and he almost didn't answer. He was already carrying 200 active cases, working 16-hour days, and surviving on coffee and determination. The last thing he needed was another court appointment, another impossible case with no resources and no hope of a positive outcome. "Chen," he answered, balancing the phone between his ear and shoulder while he reviewed case files that seemed to multiply like bacteria in a petri dish. "Mr. Chen, this is Judge Williams' clerk. The judge has requested that you take on a case pro bono, a veteran named Robert Sullivan." David stopped what he was doing, his pen frozen halfway through a signature. Judge Williams didn't make personal requests lightly, and she certainly didn't call in favors for simple trespass cases. In the 5 years he had been practicing in her courtroom, she had never made a request like this. "What's the story?" he asked, setting down his pen and giving the call his full attention. "Homeless veteran charged with criminal trespass. 4th offense. Judge postponed sentencing for a week specifically to get him representation." David was quiet for a moment, his mind racing through the implications. Judge Williams was known for her fairness, but she was also known for her efficiency. She didn't delay cases without good reason, and she didn't personally intervene in routine matters. His parents had fled Vietnam in 1975, part of the wave of refugees who escaped Saigon as it fell to the North Vietnamese army. They had told him stories about American soldiers who had helped them, who had risked their lives to get civilians to safety during the chaotic evacuation. His father still kept a faded photograph of himself as a young man, standing next to a Marine who had helped his family reach the evacuation point at Tan Son Nhut Airport. The Marine in the photograph was young, maybe 20 or 21, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He was holding David's infant sister, who had been sick with fever during the evacuation. The Marine had given her medicine from his own first aid kit and had carried her when David's mother was too weak to continue. David's father had tried for years to find that Marine, to thank him, but had never been able to track him down. "I'll take it," David said without hesitation. "Send me the file." "Thank you, Mr. Chen. The defendant is supposed to report to your office at 9 a.m. David hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, looking around his cluttered office. The walls were covered with diplomas and certificates, Harvard Law School, Order of the Coif, various bar admissions. But the most important thing in the room was a small framed photograph on his desk. His parents as young refugees, standing with their children in front of the Statue of Liberty, finally safe in America. When Bobby Sullivan walked into David Chen's office at 9 a.m. sharp, David was struck by how the man carried himself. Despite the worn clothes and the obvious signs of life on the streets, there was something in Bobby's posture that spoke of military training, of a man who had once stood at attention and meant it. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to conserve energy, to make every movement count. Bobby's appearance was shocking up close. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his skin weathered by years of exposure to the elements. His hands were cracked and scarred, the nails broken and dirty. But his eyes were alert and intelligent, and when he shook David's hand, his grip was firm and steady. "Mr. Sullivan, please sit down," David said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Judge Williams asked me to represent you. I want you to know that this is pro bono. You won't owe me anything." Bobby sat carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. He looked around the office, taking in the law books, the diplomas, the comfortable furniture. It was a world away from the holding cells and shelters where he usually found himself. "Why?" he asked simply, his voice rough from years of shouting to be heard over traffic and wind. It was a fair question, and David had been asking himself the same thing during the sleepless night he had spent thinking about this case. "Because everyone deserves good representation," David said, "and because I think there's more to your story than what's in this police report." David opened the thin file and read through the charges again. 4 arrests for trespass in 2 years, all at different locations. You're not targeting specific places or causing damage. You're just trying to find somewhere warm to sleep." Bobby nodded, his expression guarded. "I don't mean to cause trouble. I get cold." "The leg, it doesn't work right in the cold. Hurts something fierce." "Tell me about your military service," David said, leaning forward slightly. For the first time since entering the office, Bobby's expression changed. Something shuttered behind his eyes, and his hands clenched slightly in his lap. The question had touched something deep and painful, a wound that had never properly healed. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Vietnam?" Bobby nodded, his jaw tightening. "My parents were refugees from Saigon," David said carefully. "They always told me that American soldiers helped them escape. They said they owed their lives to Marines who stayed behind to help civilians get out." Bobby looked up sharply, studying David's face as if seeing him for the first time. There was something in his expression, recognition maybe, or just the shared understanding that comes from having survived something terrible. "What year?" Bobby asked, his voice suddenly more focused. 1975, April." Bobby was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, lost in memories that were 50 years old but felt like yesterday. "I was there," he said finally, "at the evacuation. We pulled a lot of families out those last few days. Chaos like you wouldn't believe. People desperate to get out, knowing what would happen if they stayed behind." David felt something shift in the room, a connection forming across decades and cultures, and the vast distance between a successful lawyer and a homeless veteran. "Mr. Sullivan, Bobby, I want to help you, but I need you to trust me enough to tell me the whole story. Not just about the trespassing, but about everything. About Vietnam, about what happened after you came home, about how you ended up sleeping in parking garages." Bobby was quiet for so long that David began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion he'd been holding back for decades. "I saved some boys over there," he said, his hands trembling slightly. "Good boys. Boys who deserved to make it home." He reached into his coat pocket with shaking fingers and pulled out the rusted dog tags, placing them on David's desk with the reverence of someone handling a religious relic. This one didn't make it. Michael Williams, 22 years old, had a baby daughter back home he never got to meet. David picked up the tags carefully, feeling the weight of 50 years of grief and guilt in the corroded metal. The edges were sharp, where the corrosion had eaten away at the surface, and he could barely make out the faded letters of the name. "I was supposed to keep him safe," Bobby continued, his voice breaking. "All of them. That was my job. Squad leader, responsible for my boys. And I failed. But you said you saved some of them. 8 boys made it out of that ambush because I dragged them to safety. But Michael took a round to the chest while I was pulling out the others. By the time I got back to him," Bobby's voice broke completely, and tears began to stream down his weathered cheeks. "He was dying, and all he could talk about was his baby girl. Kept saying her name. Patricia. Said he wanted to tell her he loved her, that he was sorry he wouldn't be there to watch her grow up." David felt the pieces clicking into place, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. The personal request from Judge Williams, the unusual delay in sentencing, the careful way she had looked at Bobby in the courtroom. "Bobby," he said carefully, his voice gentle, "what was Michael's last name again?" "Williams. Michael Williams, from Detroit." Showed me pictures of his wife and baby. Beautiful little girl with dark hair and big brown eyes. Said she was going to be a heartbreaker when she grew up. David was already reaching for his phone, his mind racing through the implications. Judge Patricia Williams, a veteran named Michael Williams from Detroit, a baby daughter named Patricia. "Bobby, I need to make some calls. Can you wait here for a few hours? I'll have my assistant get you some coffee and something to eat." Bobby nodded, still lost in memories that were 50 years old but felt like yesterday. "Take your time, son. I ain't got nowhere else to be." David spent the next 4 hours on the phone and computer, pulling strings and calling in favors from contacts at the National Archives, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Marine Corps Historical Division. What he found made him understand why Judge Williams had made that personal request, and why she had looked at Bobby Sullivan like she was seeing a ghost. The official records were sparse, buried in the vast bureaucracy of military archives. But they were there. Marine Corporal Robert J. Sullivan had served with distinction in Vietnam from 1973 to 1975, during the final chaotic years of American involvement. He had been awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received in action and had been recommended for the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States. But the Silver Star recommendation had never been processed. Bobby had been medically discharged after losing his leg in the same action that had earned him the recommendation, and somehow, in the chaos of the war's end and the massive drawdown of forces, his paperwork had been lost in the shuffle. He had fallen through the cracks of a system that was more concerned with getting out of Vietnam than with taking care of the men who had served there. More importantly, David found the after-action report from the ambush that had cost Michael Williams his life. The report, classified for decades and only recently released under the Freedom of Information Act, painted a picture of extraordinary heroism under fire. On 15 April 1975, during the evacuation of Saigon, Corporal Sullivan's squad was conducting a security patrol when they were ambushed by North Vietnamese regulars. Despite suffering severe wounds to his right leg from an enemy grenade, Corporal Sullivan repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to evacuate wounded Marines from the kill zone. His actions directly resulted in the survival of 8 Marines who would otherwise have been killed or captured. Corporal Sullivan's selfless courage and devotion to his fellow Marines exemplify the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Naval Service. The report was signed by Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, who had gone on to become a general before retiring in 1995. David found Morrison's contact information in the Marine Corps directory and made a call that would change everything. "General Morrison? This is David Chen. I'm a defense attorney in Detroit. I'm calling about a Marine who served under your command in Vietnam, Corporal Robert Sullivan." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and David could hear the old man's breathing, heavy with emotion. "Bobby Sullivan," the general said finally, his voice thick with memory. "I haven't heard that name in decades. Is he still alive?" "Yes, sir, and he needs help." When David explained the situation, the homelessness, the arrests, the decades of being forgotten by the system, General Morrison was quiet for a long time. "Mr. Chen," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of command, "Bobby Sullivan is one of the finest Marines I ever had the privilege to serve with. If he's in trouble, you tell him that Jim Morrison said the Corps doesn't forget its own. And you tell him that Silver Star recommendation is going to be processed, even if I have to hand-deliver it to the Pentagon myself." David hung up the phone and looked across his office at Bobby, who was sitting quietly, staring out the window at the Detroit skyline. The city sprawled before them, a mixture of decay and renewal, of abandoned buildings and new construction, of hope and despair existing side by side. "Bobby," he said, "we need to talk." The week passed quickly, with David working around the clock to prepare for what he knew would be more than just a simple trespass hearing. He had contacted Judge Williams Clark and requested a full hearing with the opportunity to present character witnesses and military records. The clerk had seemed surprised by the request, but had agreed to schedule 2 hours for the case. David had also reached out to 3 of the Marines who had been saved in that ambush 50 years ago. 2 of them were still alive, and both had agreed to fly to Detroit to testify on Bobby's behalf. The third had died of cancer 5 years earlier, but his widow had sent a letter describing how her husband had talked about Bobby Sullivan until the day he died, calling him the bravest man he had ever known. On the morning of the hearing, Bobby sat in David's office wearing a suit that David had bought for him. It was the first time Bobby had worn anything other than street clothes in over a decade, and he kept tugging at the tie uncomfortably, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar knot. "You don't have to do this," Bobby said for the 10th time, his voice filled with anxiety. "I can just plead guilty and do the 30 days. I've done time before. It's not so bad in the winter. 3 meals a day, warm bed, medical care." "Bobby," David said firmly, adjusting the man's tie with gentle hands, "you're not just fighting for yourself here. You're fighting for every veteran who's been forgotten by the system, and you're fighting for the memory of Michael Williams and the 7 other Marines you saved." Bobby was quiet, his hands folded in his lap, the dog tags visible in his palm where he clutched them like a talisman. "What if she doesn't believe it?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "What if she thinks I'm just making it up to get out of trouble? What if she thinks I'm just some crazy old homeless guy telling war stories?" "She'll believe it," David said with more confidence than he felt, "because it's the truth, and because I think she already knows who you are." The courtroom was more crowded than usual for a trespass hearing. Word had somehow gotten out that something unusual was happening, and several local veterans advocates had shown up, along with a reporter from the Detroit Free Press and a camera crew from Channel 7 News. The gallery was filled with an unusual mix of people: lawyers, veterans, social workers, and curious onlookers who had heard rumors about the case. Judge Williams entered and took her seat, her expression carefully neutral. She had spent the week doing her own research, reading through her father's letters and the few official documents her mother had saved. She knew what David Chen was going to present, and she wasn't sure she was emotionally prepared for it. The letters were stored in a shoebox in her bedroom closet, yellowed with age and fragile from handling. She had read them countless times over the years, searching for clues about her father's life, about the man he had been before she was born. Most of them were routine: descriptions of the weather, complaints about the food, requests for care packages from home. But scattered throughout were references to his fellow Marines, and one name appeared more than any other: Bobby Sullivan. "There's a Marine here named Bobby Sullivan," her father had written in one letter. "He's older than most of us, maybe 21 or 22. The guys call him Pops because he looks out for everyone. He's the kind of Marine you want watching your back. If something happens to me over here, I hope it's Bobby who's with me." "The court calls the case of People versus Robert James Sullivan," the clerk announced, her voice echoing in the packed courtroom. Bobby stood, flanked by David Chen, and faced the bench. For a moment, Judge Williams allowed herself to really look at him, to see past the worn clothes and the obvious signs of hardship to the man underneath. She could see her father in him, the same quiet strength, the same way of holding himself even when the world had beaten him down. "Your Honor," David began, his voice clear and confident, "before we address the charges against Mr. Sullivan, I would like to present evidence that I believe is relevant to the court's consideration of this case." Prosecutor Bradley stood up, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to Bobby's borrowed clothes. "Your Honor, this is a simple trespass case. I don't see how military records from 50 years ago are relevant to the current charges. The defendant was found sleeping illegally on private property. The law is clear, and the penalty is prescribed. We shouldn't waste the court's time with irrelevant testimony." Judge Williams looked at Bobby, who was standing at attention despite his obvious discomfort, his hands clasped behind his back in the military position of parade rest. "I'll allow it," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "Proceed, Mr. Chen." David walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder, his movements deliberate and professional. "Your Honor, the man standing before you today is not just a homeless veteran who made a mistake. He is a decorated Marine who served his country with distinction and who saved the lives of 8 fellow Marines in combat. He is also the man who saved the life of Marine Lance Corporal Michael Williams in April of 1975, during the evacuation of Saigon." Judge Williams felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her expression steady through years of judicial training. David continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Lance Corporal Williams was 22 years old when he died in that ambush. He left behind a wife and a 6-month-old daughter. Before he died, he told Corporal Sullivan to tell his daughter that he loved her, that he was proud of her, and that he would always be watching over her." The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Williams could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of 50 years of questions finally being answered. "Your Honor, I would like to call my first witness, General James Morrison, United States Marine Corps, retired." An elderly man in a dress blue uniform walked to the witness stand, his bearing still military despite his age. His chest was covered with ribbons and decorations, the accumulated honors of a lifetime of service. He was sworn in and took his seat, his eyes never leaving Bobby's face. "General Morrison," David said, "did you serve with the defendant in Vietnam?" "I did. Bobby Sullivan was one of the finest Marines I ever had the privilege to command." "Can you tell the court about the action in which Lance Corporal Williams was killed?" General Morrison looked directly at Bobby as he spoke, his voice carrying the authority of command and the weight of memory. "We were conducting an evacuation operation when we were ambushed by North Vietnamese forces. The enemy had set up a kill zone and we walked right into it. Corporal Sullivan was wounded early in the engagement, took shrapnel from a grenade in his right leg, but he refused medical evacuation. Instead, he repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to pull wounded Marines to safety." The general's voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. "He saved 8 men that day, including Lance Corporal Williams initially. Williams was hit by a second round while Sullivan was rescuing other Marines. By the time Sullivan could get back to him, Williams was dying." "What did Lance Corporal Williams say before he died?" "He asked Sullivan to tell his daughter that he loved her. He said her name was Patricia and that she was the most beautiful baby in the world. He said he was sorry he wouldn't be there to see her grow up, but that he wanted her to know that her daddy was a Marine and that Marines never give up." Judge Williams closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She could hear her mother's voice telling her the same story, the story of how her father's last words had been about his love for his daughter. "General Morrison," David continued, "was Corporal Sullivan recommended for any decorations for his actions that day?" "He was recommended for the Silver Star, the nation's 3rd highest decoration for valor. Unfortunately, due to administrative errors during the drawdown after the war, the recommendation was never processed. It's one of the great injustices of my career that a Marine of Bobby Sullivan's caliber never received the recognition he deserved." David turned to the judge, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "Your Honor, I have here the original recommendation for the Silver Star, signed by then Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and endorsed by the regimental commander. I also have the after-action report detailing Corporal Sullivan's heroic actions." He handed the documents to the clerk, who passed them to Judge Williams. As she read, her hands began to shake, and she had to set the papers down to compose herself. "I would also like to call Staff Sergeant Thomas Rodriguez, retired, who was one of the Marines saved by Corporal Sullivan." A Hispanic man in his 70s walked to the witness stand, moving slowly with the careful gait of someone whose body had been broken and rebuilt multiple times. His left arm hung at an odd angle, and there were scars visible on his neck and face. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," David said, "were you present during the ambush in question?" "I was. I was a 19-year-old private, and I was scared out of my mind. When the shooting started, I froze up. Bobby Sullivan dragged me out of that kill zone and saved my life. What do you remember about Corporal Sullivan's actions that day?" Rodriguez looked directly at Bobby, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I remember him bleeding from his leg, but he kept going back for more guys. He could have stayed in cover, could have waited for the medevac, but he didn't. He kept saying, 'We don't leave anyone behind.' And he meant it. Even when the corpsman was trying to work on his leg, he kept pushing him away, saying there were other guys who needed help more." "Did you stay in touch with Corporal Sullivan after the war?" Rodriguez shook his head sadly, his voice breaking. "I tried to find him for years. I wanted to thank him, wanted him to know that I got married, had kids, had a good life because of what he did. But he just disappeared. It's like the system forgot about him." David called one more witness, Sergeant First Class William Murphy, who told a similar story of being saved by Bobby Sullivan's courage and selflessness. Murphy was now a successful businessman in Chicago, and he had flown to Detroit specifically to testify on Bobby's behalf. "Bobby Sullivan gave me my life back," Murphy said, his voice strong and clear. "Everything I've accomplished, every day I've had with my family, I owe to him. It's a debt I can never repay." When the witnesses were finished, David turned back to Judge Williams, his voice carrying the weight of truth and justice. "Your Honor, the man standing before you is not a criminal. He is a hero who has been failed by the very system he served. He has been living on the streets not because he is a danger to society, but because society has forgotten its obligation to him." David paused, looking directly at Judge Williams, his next words carefully chosen. "Your Honor, I believe you have a personal connection to this case that the court should be aware of." Judge Williams felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack, the walls she had built around her emotions starting to crumble. "Mr. Chen," she said carefully, her voice barely steady, "what are you suggesting?" "Your Honor, I believe you are the daughter that Lance Corporal Michael Williams was talking about when he died. I believe you are Patricia Williams, and that the man standing before you carried your father's last words for 50 years. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Judge Williams sat frozen, staring at Bobby Sullivan, who was looking back at her with recognition dawning in his eyes like sunrise after a long night. "Patricia," Bobby said softly, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom like a prayer. "You're Patricia. You're Michael's little girl." Judge Williams stood up abruptly, her professional composure finally cracking like ice in spring. "Court is in recess," she announced, her voice shaking with emotion. 15 minutes. She fled to her chambers, leaving behind a courtroom full of stunned observers and one homeless veteran who finally understood why a judge had shown him unexpected mercy. In her chambers, Judge Williams sat behind her desk and wept for the first time in years. She wept for the father she had never known, for the man who had carried his memory for 5 decades, and for the cruel irony that had brought them together in a courtroom where one was judging the other for the crime of trying to survive. The tears came in waves, 50 years of suppressed grief and unanswered questions finally finding release. She thought about all the times she had wondered about her father's war, about the men he had served with, about whether any of them remembered him. She had never imagined that one of them had been carrying his dog tags all these years, had been living with the guilt of not being able to save him. There was a soft knock on her door. "Come in," she said, wiping her eyes and trying to compose herself. David Chen entered, closing the door behind him with gentle care. "Your Honor, I know this is difficult, but—" "Mr. Chen," she interrupted, her voice thick with emotion, "I should recuse myself from this case. I clearly have a conflict of interest. With respect, Your Honor, I don't think you do. You're not judging Bobby Sullivan because of who he is to you. You're judging him because of who he is, period, and who he is a hero." Judge Williams was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph of her father that she kept hidden in her desk drawer. "He's been carrying my father's dog tags for 50 years, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am. And he's been carrying the guilt of not being able to save your father for just as long. But he did save my father. My father lived long enough to come home, to hold me, to write letters about the man who saved his life. My father died in a car accident 2 years after the war ended, not in Vietnam." David nodded, understanding the full tragedy of the situation. "Bobby doesn't know that. He's been living with the belief that he failed your father, that he let him die." Judge Williams stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where her father had grown up, where he had dreamed of coming home to raise his daughter. "What do you want me to do, Mr. Chen?" "I want you to do what you've always done. I want you to do justice." When court reconvened, Judge Williams had regained her composure, but there was something different in her demeanor. The professional mask was still in place, but underneath it was something more human, more vulnerable. She looked directly at Bobby Sullivan as she spoke, seeing him not as a defendant, but as the man who had given her father the chance to come home. "Mr. Sullivan, please approach the bench." Bobby walked forward, his movements uncertain, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Mr. Sullivan, I want you to know that the charges against you are being dismissed. But more than that, I want you to know that you did not fail my father. He came home from Vietnam. He lived for 2 more years, and he spent that time talking about the Marine who saved his life. He died in a car accident in 1977, and his last words were about how much he loved me." Bobby's legs gave out, and he sank to his knees in front of the bench, sobbing with the release of 50 years of guilt and grief. "He made it home," he whispered through his tears. "He made it home." Judge Williams stepped down from the bench, abandoning all protocol, and knelt beside the man who had saved her father's life. "He made it home because of you," she said, her own tears flowing freely. "And now it's time for you to come home too." The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of Bobby Sullivan's tears, 50 years of grief and guilt finally being released. In that moment, the formal boundaries between judge and defendant, between the system and the individual, dissolved into something more fundamental. The connection between 2 people whose lives had been shaped by the same act of heroism. General Morrison stood up in the gallery and began to clap, his hands coming together in slow, measured applause. One by one, Everyone in the courtroom joined him. The lawyers, the court staff, the veterans in the gallery, the reporters, even Prosecutor Bradley. The room was filled with applause for a hero who had been forgotten for too long. 3 months later, Bobby Sullivan stood in the same courtroom, but everything was different. He was wearing a new suit, his hair was cut and his beard trimmed, and his eyes were clear for the first time in decades. The haunted look was gone, replaced by something that might have been peace. He was surrounded by Marines, both active duty and retired, who had come to witness a ceremony that was 50 years overdue. The courtroom was packed with veterans, their families, and members of the community who had heard Bobby's story and wanted to show their support. General Morrison, now wearing his dress blue uniform with all his ribbons and decorations, stepped forward, carrying a small blue box. His voice carried the authority of a lifetime of military service as he spoke. "Corporal Robert James Sullivan," he said, his words echoing in the silent courtroom, "for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States, the President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Silver Star to you." He opened the box, revealing the Silver Star medal that Bobby had earned half a century ago, its surface gleaming under the courtroom lights. "Your selfless courage and devotion to your fellow Marines exemplify the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and reflect great credit upon yourself and the United States Naval Service." As General Morrison pinned the medal to Bobby's chest, Judge Williams watched from the bench, tears streaming down her face. In her hand, she held her father's dog tags, which Bobby had returned to her with the words, "These belong with his daughter." The ceremony was covered by every major news outlet in Detroit, and the story went viral on social media. Bobby Sullivan became a symbol of the forgotten veterans who had served their country with honor, only to be abandoned by the system they had defended. After the ceremony, Bobby approached the bench one last time. "Your Honor," he said, his voice strong and clear, "I want you to know that your father was proud of you. In those last few minutes when he was dying, he kept talking about his little girl and how he wanted to watch her grow up. He said he wanted you to know that your daddy was a Marine and that Marines never give up. He would be so proud of the woman you became." Judge Williams smiled through her tears, feeling a connection to her father that she had never experienced before. "He would be proud of you too, Bobby. He would be proud that you never gave up, that you survived, and that you're finally getting the recognition you deserve." Bobby nodded, then turned to leave. At the door of the courtroom, he paused and looked back. "Thank you," he said simply, "for remembering." 6 months later, Bobby Sullivan was living in a small apartment provided by the VA, receiving the disability benefits and medical care he should have been getting for decades. The apartment was modest but comfortable, with a view of the Detroit River, and enough space for the few possessions he had accumulated over the years. He volunteered at a local veterans shelter, helping other homeless vets navigate the system that had failed him for so long. His story had inspired changes in how the VA handled cases of homeless veterans, and several new programs had been established to prevent other heroes from falling through the cracks. Judge Williams continued to serve on the bench, but she had started a foundation in her father's name to provide legal services to homeless veterans. David Chen had left the public defender's office to work for the foundation full-time, and together they had helped dozens of veterans get the benefits and recognition they deserved. And every year, on the anniversary of the ambush that had changed all their lives, Bobby Sullivan and Judge Patricia Williams met at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Detroit. They would stand together in silence, remembering the young Marine who had brought them together across 5 decades and honoring all the heroes who had been forgotten by the system they had served. The dog tags were no longer rusted beyond recognition. Judge Williams had had them restored, and now they hung in a place of honor in her chambers, a reminder that sometimes justice is not about punishment, but about remembering who we are and who we owe our freedom to. And sometimes, just sometimes, the system works the way it's supposed to and heroes get the recognition they deserve, even if it comes 50 years too late. In the end, Bobby Sullivan learned that he hadn't failed Michael Williams after all. He had given him the most precious gift possible. Time. Time to come home, time to hold his daughter, time to write letters about the Marine who had saved his life, time to live, even if it was only for 2 more years. And Michael Williams, through his daughter, had finally given Bobby Sullivan something he had been searching for his entire adult life: forgiveness, recognition, and the knowledge that his sacrifice had mattered. On quiet evenings in his apartment, Bobby would sit by the window and watch the sun set over Detroit, the city that had finally welcomed him home. He would think about the boys he had served with, the ones who made it home and the ones who didn't, and he would feel something he hadn't felt in 50 years: peace. The circle was complete, and both men could finally rest in peace. The last entry in Bobby's journal, found after his peaceful death at age 78, read simply, "Mission accomplished. All my boys are accounted for."